Hello and welcome to this session of Kirloskar Vasundhara Film Festival. Have you ever walked into a forest in India? Some of you might have visited national parks or wildlife sanctuaries. However, many of the forests that we come across in India are either secondary forests or patches of wilderness or at best plantations. Have you walked into a real forest? If not, you're in luck. Because today we're going to be taken through a real ancient forest which is called as a Devrai or a sacred grove. We're going to take a walk through in the Mandar Devrai, which is situated in the northern Western Ghats near Pune city. A Devrai is a patch of an old growth forest which has been conserved effectively over centuries by local communities. India has several thousand such sacred groves or Devrais as they are called in Marathi. These forests help us understand the species composition in that area. These Devrais are gene banks which help us to understand the species composition in forests centuries ago. Today, we shall be walking into the Mandar Devrai to look at the treasures which are hidden in these ancient forests. We are going to be led by Dr. Mandar Datar, India's leading young botanist who is a scientist at the Agarkar Research Institute. The eminent Agarkar Research Institute has done seminal work in studying and understanding the Devrais of India, which has helped conservation efforts. Dr. Mandar is an author of several books and international papers. Today, he will take us around the Devrai and help us understand some of the secrets of these ancient forests. So without much ado, let's walk behind Dr. Mandar.
So can you explain the concept of sacred groves?
Sacred groves are basically protected forest patches for a particular deity. The deity is often a local deity. So many times Shaiva deities are there, female deities are there. And then it's a kind of a tradition. So we look at sacred groves as not just a biodiversity point of view, it's a biocultural diversity. So it's a biodiversity as well as diversity of traditional conservation practices associated with that. So you protect this area for the sake of deity. The collection of trees or normal harvesting that you do in surrounding regions is a strict taboo here. You're not supposed to collect even a twig of plant from here, and that's how it's protected. So what is the significance of this protection is we can predict about the past forest. So if you ask me what was the past forest in a particular region, I will simply close my eyes and go to any nearby sacred grove and say like this is the pocket of relic forest growing there, and that was in the surrounding region.
So that is why it is also called as a gene bank.
This is a gene bank because the species, the prominent species of that particular region are now conserved in sacred groves, and those species which are lost in the surrounding region, because since this is a very pristine and unique kind of habitat, if you expose it to more anthropogenic pressures or more sunlight, more soil erosion, majority of the species will be lost because they have adapted to this particular environment. It's kind of a food web in which they fit well, but you remove one component of that and they are vanishing. So those rare and threatened species those are useful as medicinal plants, useful by local people for various other purposes, are stored in the sacred grove, are protected. That's why they are called as gene bank. In addition to that, they are storehouse of wild edible plants. That's most important. So wild edible species are species that are consumed by local people, and in addition to that, you have many wild relatives of crop plants that are protected in this. So we have poaceae, grasses and legumes dominate our food, and fortunately for a Western Ghat region, this poaceae and leguminosae is dominant family in the wilder landscapes also.
Okay.
So since there are many wild relatives of crop plants that are protected in sacred groves, we need them for future needs, future purpose.
So how many sacred groves would we have in India and Maharashtra?
Maharashtra, the number is known, around 3,000 sacred groves, so of which 2,600 are there in Sindhurga district itself, and rest others spread in other districts of Maharashtra, Pune, Satara, Nashik, Kolhapur.
And what would be the average size?
Size depends on the local beliefs, local conditions, local original forest patch. So they start from a small cluster of few trees to say many hectares. This is a big sacred grove.
Now that we have the number, is it now protected by law?
So majority of these sacred groves are community owned. Few of them are under personal jurisdiction, and only few are under forest department or part of national parks and sanctuaries. So it depends on the local people or community whether to protect them or not. Because over the years what has happened is there is shift in religious beliefs. So since we say that these groves are protected for the sake of God, the new generation people are coming up and saying that we'll construct a temple instead of maintaining this old kind of shabby forest for them. So that shift is going to be making a major role in how we see sacred groves in future. This is a kind of evergreen forest. So what is the major difference between an evergreen forest and deciduous forest is deciduous forest will shed their leaves once in a year. So at the beginning in our region, at the beginning of January, February, March, you have this entire leaves are shed and then the species flowers. But when you compare it with evergreen forest, what evergreen forests do is they shed these leaves round the year. So you can see a lot of leaf litter, humus collected inside the sacred groves, which you can see it here.
So Mandar, this is a beautiful place, and this is something very strange which I keep observing when we go out of the forest, that you hardly see such climbers and such thick woody climbers. What is it that makes the woody climbers a characteristic of an old forest?
Okay, so let me tell you something about this forest itself. So this is a evergreen forest. We call technically this, we classify as broadleaf evergreen forest. So in evergreen forest you see large number of species, so it's a very good environment for species to grow, good climate, water wise, precipitation wise, soil wise. And then there is huge competition amongst trees, so large number of species grow there. There is a competition, and when you have competition amongst trees for reaching taller heights, so you have no space for herbaceous and other kind of vegetation to grow here because hardly sunlight reaches ground. So in those circumstances, certain species which are climber by nature grow in this forest. So they start growing at the base of any tree wherever they find. So wherever they seed germinate, and then they reach canopy level. They have to reach canopy level to spread their foliage, because ultimately this battle between these trees and this liana is going to be to capture sunlight. So once this has to start growing and then reach top canopy layer where it will spread its foliage and starts photosynthesizing. And for that purpose you see in these kinds of forest you have a large number of lianas. So there are two kinds of species under climber. Some grow tendrils, some doesn't grow tendrils. We call them as a creeper. They just creep. Okay. And then climbers, you use a certain kind of mechanisms like tendrils to grow, to take support of other species and grow. But then these species start growing on the host trees itself. So there are plenty of logs inside, plenty of trees growing inside. So they start coiling around those trees and try to reach canopy. And then they are very old. You can imagine probably this must be more than 100 years old, these climbers, lianas.
So you said one word, which is competition between trees.
Yes.
Does that mean that the liana will kill a tree?
Lianas will not kill a tree, at least here in this kind of forest. But there are certain other groups of species, we call them as figs, strangling figs. So certain species of figs. So figs, you know, bargad, this banyan tree is fig, cluster fig, and then the edible fig, pimpal is fig. So there are many species of this genus ficus in Western Ghats. So this fig species are mostly the seed dispersal is done through the agency of birds.
And we can hear one right now.
Exactly, the same bird disperses this fig. So then when the droppings of this bird droppings on the figs on branches, they start germinating, this strangling figs. Okay. So for normal seeds you have to reach ground for germination, but for stranglers they can germinate on the taller trees. So now they start growing in two directions. One is positively geotropic towards soil. Their roots will start growing towards soil. Their shoots will start growing towards sky, negatively geotropic. And then they have, once they reach ground, roots reach ground, they start competing with the host trees for water. And the shoot starts competing with the host tree for sunlight. And then after some days, the reticulation of the network, the root network, that what they surround around the host tree, that literally kills that host tree. So those stranglers is a peculiarity of these kinds of forest, in addition to these lianas.
So one question which I had, Mandar, is that you see a lot of ferns when you come into a forest like this, but you don't see ferns outside. Is there any specific reason for that?
The reason is like ferns need pristine environment. So once ferns were dominating this earth, but now angiosperms, the recent flowering plants, have spread everywhere. So very specific habitats are there only where ferns are present today.
Okay. And so would you say that if there is a presence of ferns, then the microhabitat or the microclimate is...
Exactly. So as I said, majority of the species, plant species that surround us are angiosperms. So very few species are from other groups. And that's why
is one of the
they need very specific older climates, like pre-human climates where there was no degradation, no secondary formations like what are there outside. So they are here.
So can you say what is an angiosperm in simple English?
So angiosperms, and there are two groups of major, as per earlier classification, there are two groups of plants. Lower group, all are non-flowering plants, they don't produce flowers. And then flowering plants. So under flowering plants you have two groups. One is gymnosperms, which have seeds directly produced on the plant. And you don't see fruits in them. And normal angiosperms, the most common group of plants surrounding us are angiosperms, which have seeds produced inside a fruit. You can see the difference. Outside, the vegetation is kind of secondary. Secondary in the sense, earlier you can assume that the similar kind of vegetation existed outside, but this area being protected, the outside vegetation is subjected to anthropogenic pressures, and you have species which can tolerate sunlight, grow outside. So on the edge of these sacred groves, you have very distinct communities. So we call in ecology that as edge effect. So certain species which can tolerate high sunlight only grow on these edges of these sacred groves. Say there are three components. One is botanical component of plants which produce food. They synthesize food through a process called photosynthesis. Then there are consumers which depend on these photosynthetic organisms which produce their own food. So we technically call first group as autotrophs, which can prepare their own food, and heterotrophs which depend on these groups. So once these organisms are dead, heterotrophs and autotrophs are dead, you need a third component in the form of microbes and fungi to degrade them and to bring back those minerals or nutrients which have been sequestered in them back to new life. So that work is done by microbes and fungi. and then you have large number of, so probably if you ask me how many flowering plant species will be there, say I'll say some 300, 400 here. But if you ask me microbes, number of microbes and number of fungi here, there'll be countless
In this particular patch.
particular sacred grove itself. So they degrade dry decaying matter, this humus, woods, animal dead bodies, and bring back those minerals and nutrients to the cycle again. So you can see here. So this is a kind of fungi growing, which is producing threads or fiber-like thing, which is known as mycelia. So this particular fungi is now degrading this dead petiole of a plant.
So what is the role of mycelia in soil health?
These are mycelia are basically so fungi are non-flowering plants, so they reproduce by means of spore. So once a spore reaches a particular substratum where it is supposed to colonize and grow, it will produce thread-like structures known as mycelia. These mycelia are basic components which actually degrade things. And once few mycelia come together, then they produce fruiting bodies. And from those fruiting bodies, spores are again liberated for their next generation.
And those fruiting bodies we know as mushrooms.
Fruiting bodies are mushrooms.
Yeah.
So apart from mushrooms, there are many
Others
fungi
also.
producing different kinds of fruiting bodies. Right. If you want to identify evergreen forest, or if you want to associate evergreen forest, there are few characteristics of them. One, as you told, Lina is one such thing, strangling fig is another. Third thing, again with it has to deal with the competition. So herbaceous species or bushy species will not grow on the ground here. Very few will be there because again sunlight is a matter. Then second thing, so certain species of plants start growing on the other tree for the sake of support. We technically in botany call them as epiphytes. Epi is the literal meaning of epi is above, phytes means plants. So something that is growing on the plants are epiphytes. So in this kind of forest you have many epiphytic orchids growing here. Then you have epiphytic ferns growing here. So they are not kind of a parasites. So they depend, so in parasites they have to partially depend on the host tree. But epiphytes, they just grow for the sake of support. So this kind of association we call commensalism. So commensalism is association where one partner is benefited while the other is neither benefited nor harmed. It's a very kind of interesting association. So stratification is one peculiar feature of these kinds of forest. You can get multiple stratas growing here. So the top canopy, then the middle strata and the lower strata. That's the basic classification. And then species have acclimatized in such a way that those which are lower strata species will grow in lower strata, and top strata species will go in top strata. If you go to better forest than this, say Koina, you see certain species growing above the top strata. Those are known as emergents. And whether that emergent species is deciduous or whether it is evergreen, you can predict about the health of that particular ecosystem. So in the best forest in Kerala, say you go to Silent Valley, emergents are also evergreen. And say you come to slightly northern, drier part, Molem especially, emergents are deciduous. And you don't find any emergent in this kind of forest.
So this is something which we find in a lot of urban homes as a decoration. Can you explain what this could be?
So this is a fungus known as bracket fungus. So botanically we call this as a polyporous because this has multiple large number of pores on the under surface of this particular fungi. So this must have started its life as a small spore holding this particular twig, and then mycelia would have grown, and then we have in certain stage like positive and negative mycelia, they come together and then the fruiting body is produced. Now purpose or function of this fruiting body, this polyporous, is again it will produce large number of spores, and those spores will be dispersed through these small pores, and now this is as good as dead, but it has performed its duty. So this is again subjected to further degradation by some other organism.
But is it only found on dead wood or also on live trees?
It's dead wood only.
Only dead wood.
Yes. So there is a succession of species. So if certain twig dies, like this twig, so there will be succession of species which are going to decompose this, and that succession is very interesting.
Okay.
So first you have species which will degrade or which will decompose this bark part of this. And then once this bark is the inner wood is exposed, species like polyporus will come, and then they will further break down into smaller fragments, and then microbes start working on them.
So this becomes fertilizer.
This becomes fertilizers. So this is so probably the nutrients and minerals in this will be there sequestered in the next generation forests. So this is again, I was talking to you about epiphytes. So one such group of epiphytic plants are these mosses. So mosses are basically non-flowering species. They don't produce flowers, but again their reproduction is by means of small spores. And then these mosses are unique in terms of many things. One of them is they have this desiccation tolerance ability. So as soon as, if this is on a tree, this particular moss, if it is on a tree, if it receives next first shower of the next monsoon, they start leaving back again. And if you feel it now, you will think that this is as good as dead. So there are two underlying mechanisms inside this desiccation tolerant. Some species even break down chlorophyll, so they dry but they don't die. So this strategy we call as poikilohydry in technical terms. So desiccation tolerance is a common word. So desiccation tolerance is shown by many lower groups. So some species will even break down chlorophyll and bring their metabolism rate to as low as possible and still survive the unfavorable condition. And as soon as you have next favorable condition ready, they can rejuvenate, build their chloroplast and again start functioning again.
So Mandar, this is another very interesting tree. Again, I see this only in the forest and not in city plantations. Why are these roots so triangular looking and why are they sticking out like that? Are you saying that the roots start from here somewhere?
You can say probably. So this is a special, there is a special term for these kind of roots. We call them as buttress roots. It's obviously the term adapted from civil engineering. As I'm telling, there is competition for achieving heights.
Okay.
And then you, for each species, you need to maintain that root shoot ratio so as to be in balance. That particular plant, if want to remain in equilibrium, it needs to maintain certain root shoot balance. Now here in this case, since you have to grow tall and taller, competing with other species, the root structure may not develop to a depth, because you know this particular Western Ghats areas, you have immediately rocks below. So for that purpose, if you want to sustain here, you need to develop this kind of perpendicular roots to the main trunk, and that's why they are called as buttress roots.
So Mandar, when you see a big tree like this fallen in the forest, does it serve any purpose, or does it is it good for the forest, or it should be removed?
Okay, so nothing is bad for the forest. Whatever happens here inside the ecosystem, it's some way related to the overall functioning of the system. Now this particular tree which has fallen down will soon get decomposed, and minerals, nutrients will be added to the soil again. But simultaneously, once it is dead and fallen down, it creates so many small niches for many other organisms. So if you can remove the bark, you can see multiple number of insects species living inside. So sometimes this acts as a bridge for ants and other organisms inside a dead forest. If it is a marshy forest, then these kinds of fallen trees can act as a bridges or highways for insects.
So Mandar, I found this very interesting seed, and I remember we used to call it matari when we were kids.
Right.
And I know that this is a seed and it disperses.
Okay.
So my question is, if this seed is from this forest, then why do you not see these trees outside this forest area?
Okay.
Why don't they germinate or whatever?
Okay. So to answer your question, this particular species Anodendron paniculatum,
Okay.
which grows inside as well as on the mosaic of the secondary and primary forest, just outside the sacred grove. But let me tell you slightly detail about this. Why a particular plant needs this kind of dispersal mechanism. Okay. So there are two kinds of processes very important for plant. One is pollination, one is seed dispersal.
Yeah.
So angiosperms, the flowering plants, are dependent on other vectors like animals, members of kingdom Animalia, for pollination and dispersal. Obviously, some do self pollination, self dispersal, like this is also possible, but many species depend on other groups of organisms, animals, birds, insects for their seed dispersal and pollination. So certain species, what they do is, for the sake of pollination, they depend on insects or birds. But when you depend on insects or birds for pollination, you have to put a lot of investment into that.
Okay.
So if you are self-pollinating flower, you can simply produce stamen and carpel, which are reproductive parts, and then develop the seed.
So when you're saying investment, you mean nectar production?
Investment in the sense of ATPs, means energy. So plants photosynthesize and produce food, and that same energy is utilized for various metabolic processes of this plant. So nectar, obviously, for if you want to call an insect for pollinator, you have to give them welcome drink. So welcome drink is a form of nectar. Then you have to offer them food. It's kind of a bribe. So that are often in the form of pollens. So not all the pollens produced by plants are meant to be dispersed and visit another. So they should go to another plant and pollinate. Some are even consumed by insects. So in honeybees, that's the best example. In honey, you get a lot of pollens.
Yes.
So pollens is also a source of food for them because it's a protein rich structure, protein rich substance. Nectar is sugar rich substance. But not just producing nectar and producing pollens will serve their purpose. They also need to tell the precise location where the flower is located, because the pollinator has to visit. So there are two ways by which they communicate where I am. So one way is by releasing a trail of scents in the air. So for that they have to produce volatile oils. And second thing, color. So color is also very important component for flowers. When insects comes in the vicinity of that flower, it should spot that flower, and from longer distance it can follow the trail of scents, and as it approaches the vicinity, near area, it will see the color and visit that flower.
Okay, so perfume attracts it from a far away.
Exactly.
And the color attracts it at a shorter
distance.
Interesting.
That's the mechanism precisely.
And you were saying something about
Yes, so this was about pollination.
Yes.
So if you invest a lot in pollination, then sometimes plant tend to invest less in seed dispersal. So then they produce these kinds of parachute like structures. So seed is light, so you attach that entire seed with kind of a parachute structure, and it just disperses through the agency of wind to a longer distances.
That means this is the
Easiest way, but then most often than not, plants follow other way. So they use animal dispersal agents for seed dispersal also. So for that purpose they have to create a bribe in the form of pulp. So fruit pulp, what you see, fleshy fruit, is a kind of a bribe for the animal which is going to disperse that.
Okay. So we just saw some big seeds there on the stone.
Right.
That would be from the fecal matter of
Fecal matter. So they are consumed because they have you have bribe in the form of that pulp. The pulp is consumed, but the seed coat is so thick that it is not digested by those animals. That just passes through this digestive tract, and through the droppings it will germinate. So there is some acid in the digestive tract. That acid helps that plants to slightly remove the thicken the seed coat is thick, but it's slightly becomes thin due to this acid action, and then it germinates.
Okay.
It means animal, plant, birds, everything is in
All are connected to each other. Yes.
even microbes.
Microbes also. So you say one thing all the time, that grasses have evolved to a simplicity.
Yes.
And they don't have all these elaborate, they don't have fleshy fruit, they don't have colored, perfumed. So how is the pollination and dispersal, especially in agricultural grasses?
Grasses, as you said, they are simplified structures, evolved in such a way that they don't have to depend on other agents for neither for pollination nor for dispersal.
Okay.
So they do take help of wind. For agriculture grasses, the dispersal is pollen transfer is through wind only. But then they have to produce large amount of pollens. When you have insect pollinating, you can produce small number of flowers and be sure that your pollen is going to reach the destination. But when you depend on the agency like wind, you have to produce large number of pollens. So investment is different in them. So they produce large number of pollens. But in that case, pollen doesn't necessarily need to be rich in proteins. They can be simple carbohydrates only.
You don't need to
invest in that. So it's like we technically in evolution they call this as a trade-off. So you choose which path, and then species choose the path which is less in energy consuming and more efficient, and they evolve in that direction.
So since we are on grasses, one of the things which I always notice when we go to a forest is you rarely see grasses.
Right.
And is that because the sunlight doesn't reach? What are the
Exactly. The reason is sunlight doesn't reach ground, and in our peninsular Indian grasses, they have evolved a specific photosynthetic pathway other than the normal plants do. That pathway is called a C4 pathway.
C4 path.
So C4 pathway can function in high light situations, low moisture situations. Even the carbon dioxide percentage is less, they can photosynthesize. But then those species which are adapted to high light may not grow here because they are not going to get any light here.
So agricultural grasses will not grow.
Agriculture grasses and normal peninsular Indian grasses will not grow here because they have evolved in such a way to grow in open habitats.
These secret groves or conserved forest and agriculture soil fertility, how it's related?
So basically this is like a human dominated landscape. Land use is totally dependent on like human settlements. Everything is around human settlements. So you have these kinds of sacred groves here which have many perennial streams, or this you can see is an annual stream. So this stream at one point of time when they are going to plant paddy there, cultivate paddy there, is going to take the nutrient rich water from here, and that's ultimately going to be beneficial for the agriculture itself.
So we always have read in textbooks that the Indo-Gangetic plain is very fertile because it gets a lot of sun.
Right.
But even such micro landscape, they also get alluvial soil.
Yes, it's a small model of Indo-Gangetic plains. You can see it here only.
Is here also in a smaller landscape.
Smaller landscape.
So Mandar, this is again very interesting because the way I did not see any sunlight, I think almost same way I cannot see very much ahead. This is almost like a three-dimensional forest.
Precisely. So entire space, three-dimensional space is utilized here.
Okay.
And this is unique for natural ecosystems
I see.
that you don't often see in our agriculture ecosystems.
Right. And not even in plantations.
Not even in plantations. Because there is a complexity, because in plantations in agriculture it's a monoculture, one species dominates. Here various niches are occupied by various species. So whatever left is there is occupied by some species. That's why you see this three-dimensional structure in entire forests.
Okay. And does that also mean that the fauna occupies various strata?
Exactly, fauna occupies strata because fauna is majoritarily dependent on the flora for various reasons, for sake of food, for sake of shelter, for sake of hiding themselves from their predators. So how the stratification in the forest is there for flora you can talk about similar stratification of fauna in the forest.
Now that you're saying, I remember that in the Western Ghats, I always see the giant Indian squirrel in the topmost canopy.
Topmost canopy, precisely,
Yeah.
precisely.
It is never seen on the ground.
Yes, so you see centipedes on the ground,
On the ground, yeah.
scorpions on the ground, some snakes species on the ground, and top canopy is occupied by birds like probably eagle,
Hornbills.
also there, Malabar giant squirrel, our example, Western Ghats.
And the middle canopy, I've seen langurs and macaques.
Exactly. And even if you talk about various species of insects on a bole of a tree, they have their own separations, niches carved out for each species.
But they would be agnostic of the species, right? They would grow on a liana as well as a tree.
Exactly. But then it also depends on the chemistry of tree.
Okay.
So majoritarily the insects precisely know the chemistry of plants more than a chemist. Best example is butterflies and moths laying eggs on a very specific species.
Yes.
Because that chemistry matters for them. So if a particular tree bark has certain kind of composition, then the species which are adapted to that particular chemistry will only grow there.
So every ficus has a specific moth.
Exactly.
That is the reason why.
Every ficus has a specific pollinator,
Pollinator.
wasp,
Wasp. Not
associated with it.
Okay.
Now that we know what are sacred groves and forest ecosystems, I'm sure our audience will be able to see forests from an ecological perspective. We should be able to connect the flora with the rainfall and climatic conditions of the landscape, and connect the fauna with the flora and the food availability. I hope this was an enriching walkthrough, and I thank Dr. Mandar Datar for explaining the nuances in a very simple language. And our best wishes in your future research on forests.